Hello folks, it's the Walking Widow here with some exciting grief research from over 100 years ago. We'll see. Today I'd like to explore the insights of Sigmund Freud relating to grief. He was one of the most influential figures in the history of psychology. His theories, though developed more than a century ago, still shape the way we understand human emotions and psychological processes today. What I want to talk about is his essay on mourning and melancholia. And we don't even say that word anymore. But published in 1917. It's his profound reflections on how we cope with loss, both personal and symbolic. Freud believed that grief was complex, multifaceted experience, and his ideas continue to be relevant in clinical settings and in our everyday lives. So, the nature of grief, mourning versus melancholia. Freud begins his discussion in this article by differentiating between two key responses to loss, mourning and melancholia. Mourning, according to Freud, is the natural, healthy response to the loss of a loved one or a cherished object. It is a process of grieving that involves acceptance of the loss gradually, accompanied by feelings of sadness and sorrow. The mourner slowly comes to terms with reality of the loss. In time, the emotional intensity of the grief diminishes, allowing the individual to return and resume their life. Freud viewed mourning as an adaptive process that allows the individual to withdraw emotional energy of the lost object or person and reinvest it elsewhere. Or what I call it these days is integrating your grief and learning to live without that person. Freud was clear, however, that mourning can be a long, painful, and sometimes socially isolating process. It requires time and patience, but ultimately will lead to recovery. In contrast, Freud argues that melancholia, what we now refer to as depression, is as pathological. It's a pathological form of grief. And melancholia, the individual fails to fully process the loss due to some reason or another. The emotional energy that would have been directed toward recovery becomes stuck internally. The melancholic individual, or depressed, experiences feelings of deep sadness, guilt, and self-blame. Unlike mourning, being depressed is not gradual, it is not adaptive. Instead, it becomes marked by a sense of hopelessness and inertia, which means stuck. The people are unable to move forward Another important aspect of Freud's theory on grief is the role of memory and the unconscious. We all know he loved to think about the unconscious. Freud believed that when a person experiences grief, it activates unconscious memories and unresolved emotions associated with losing that person or object. For instance, the grief process might bring up earlier experiences of loss, which is true, such as childhood abandonment or the death of a parent, which could influence how the individual processes this current grief. If they never went through the grief with the other person that passed away, how are they gonna ever process this new grief? You have to do one at a time, kind of. In depression, these unconscious elements are more pronounced. The individual may not be just grieving a present loss, but also unconsciously dealing with previous losses. Freud's ideas of the conscious and unconscious, how past experiences shape current emotions, is crucial for understanding why some people are prone to depression more than others. Freud also talked about the duration or how long grief should last. For some, the process of mourning can be short, and it really depends on the person that you lost. Months, even years. However, he emphasized that with time, the intensity of grief should naturally subside. If the individual remains immobilized by grief, unstable, and unable to let go of the past, it can develop into something more pathological, depression. The idea of a normal grieving process was important to Freud because it allowed for the possibility of psychological growth and recovery. He believed that mourning, though painful, ultimately serves to protect and adapt the person, enabling the individual to reinvest emotional energy back into life rather than remain trapped. Freud also understood that grief is not just private, internal experience, but that it has social dimensions as well. Society plays a role in how we grieve. Both the rituals of mourning and the expectations placed on us. Freud noted that the individual often faces pressure from society to move on after a certain amount of time. And boy, hasn't that gotten even more pronounced nowadays. Back in the day, when he wrote this article, people wore different clothing to indicate that they were in grief for months. And that was kind of an outward way to show people that you were still in grief, you know. Anyway, so even 100 and some years ago, people were pressured from society to move on. The tension between the need to grieve and the societal demand for normalcy can complicate the mourning process. And for Freud, this conflict could be just unreasonable stress for the mourner. And I agree. I feel that way now. Anyway, Conclusion. Freud's views on grief provide a valuable framework for understanding the complexities of human emotions in the face of loss. His distinction between mourning and depression, or melancholia, highlights the difference between the natural healing process of grief and when someone gets stuck and can't move forward. While Freud's work was groundbreaking in its time, the core ideas about grief remain relevant, and it's surprising, providing a foundation for the modern psychological and therapeutic approach for grief and loss. I know so much more research has been done since Freud, and I'm so thankful. You are not alone in your grief. Reach out to people if you need help. Love and gratitude.